fluorescent light above the nurse's station hummed the way it always did at 3 in the morning. That flat electric drone that gets into your bones if you work nights long enough. I was charting a fever spike on a 4-year-old in room 12 when my pager buzzed against my hip, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a sound so small could still make my stomach drop after 7 years on the job. It wasn't the pager that did it that night, though. It was what I saw when I looked up. A man was standing at the end of the hallway, near the elevators, holding a stuffed rabbit and a balloon that said, GAT, NWL, soon in cursive gold script. He was talking to a little boy who must have been 5, maybe 6, and the boy was tugging at his sleeve the way kids do when they want you to bend down to their level. The man bent. He laughed at something the boy said, and for a second, just a second, the angle of his shoulders and the way his hand rested on the back of the boy's neck made my heart stop so completely I had to put my pen down on the counter because my fingers had gone numb. It wasn't him. Of course it wasn't him. He lived 2,000 miles away in a glass tower in Manhattan, and I was a pediatric nurse on the late shift at Mercy Children's in a small Vermont town he'd never heard of. But for that one suspended moment, before the man turned and I saw he had a beard and brown eyes and a face that belonged to someone else entirely, I was 26 again, standing in the bathroom of a Chelsea apartment with a plastic stick shaking in my hand and a secret I would carry alone for the next 7 years. I want to tell you what happened, because I've never told the whole of it to anyone, not even my mother, especially not my mother. My daughter is asleep upstairs in her little farmhouse a half hour from the hospital, and tomorrow morning I'll braid her hair before school and pack her a peanut butter sandwich with the crusts cut off. And she'll have no idea that the man who shares her cheekbones is the reason I can still hear my own heartbeat too loud in quiet rooms. His name was Brennan. He was a corporate attorney at one of those firms that take up 6 floors of a skyscraper. The kind where the lobby has a fountain and the receptionist wears a headset and looks through you like you're made of fog. I met him at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, of all places, where I'd been roped into volunteering by a friend from nursing school. I was 25. He was 32 and already pulling in numbers I couldn't conceive of, and the first thing he ever said to me was that he liked the way I rolled my eyes when the silent auction guy mispronounced cochlear. We fell into each other fast. I think that's how it works when you're young and you've spent every Saturday for 2 years pulling double shifts and microwaving the same bowl of soup. He took me to restaurants where the menu didn't have prices on it. He bought me a coat for my birthday that cost more than my rent. I kept saying it was too much, and he kept saying I deserved it. And after a while, I stopped saying anything because I'd never had anyone look at me that way before, like I was something rare he'd found and didn't intend to put back. His parents had a place on Long Island with a tennis court. I went there once, a long weekend in July, and his mother handed me a glass of white wine on the porch and asked me what my father did for a living. I told her my father had been a long-haul trucker who died of a stroke when I was 16. She smiled the way people smile when they're deciding something about you, and she said, "How sweet that you've come so far." His father didn't talk to me at all for 2 days. I told myself it didn't matter. Brennan loved me. Brennan was going to marry me. He'd said as much one night in bed, his hand flat against my stomach, his mouth in my hair, and I had believed him the way you believe in things you want too badly to question. Then I missed a period. Then I missed another one. I sat on the closed toilet lid in our bathroom for almost an hour before I could make myself look at the test. 3 lines I'd bought because I didn't trust myself the first time or the second. All 3 said the same thing. I remember laughing, this awful breathy laugh, because the only thought in my head was that I'd just bought a sage green crib mobile in my mind, fully assembled, with little felt stars hanging from it, before I'd even processed that I was pregnant. I didn't tell him that night. He came home late smelling like bourbon and the cologne of whatever client dinner he'd been at, and he kissed the top of my head and asked what was for dinner, and I said I'd ordered Thai, and that was that. I didn't tell him the next night either, or the night after. There's a particular cowardice that lives in waiting, and I lived in it for almost 3 weeks. The reason I waited, the real reason, was that I'd started to notice things. The way his phone face down on the counter had become a habit instead of an accident. The way he came home later, and his answers got shorter and shorter. The way, at his cousin's engagement party 2 weekends before, a woman in a red dress had touched his arm in a manner that made me look at the floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself pregnancy hormones do strange things to your head, even though I was barely into my second month and nothing had any business doing anything yet. The night I finally tried to tell him, he came home with takeout from the sushi place I liked, which should have been my first clue. He set it down on the kitchen island and he said very quietly, "We need to talk." I sat down. He stood. He told me he'd been thinking for a while. He told me things had felt off between us, that we wanted different things, that he'd grown and I hadn't. Or maybe it was the other way around. He used the word trajectory. I will hate that word until the day I die. He said there was someone, that it had only just become serious, that he was sorry but he wanted to be honest with me. Her name was Camille. She was an associate at a different firm. She was 23. I didn't say anything for a long time. I sat there with my hands in my lap, and the words I'd been rehearsing for 3 weeks were stuck somewhere behind my teeth, and they wouldn't come out. He was already grieving the ending he'd written in his head, the clean version where I cried a little and called him cruel and then we'd both move on. If I told him now, in that kitchen, with the sushi between us getting warm in its plastic clamshell, what I had inside me, I knew exactly what would happen. He would do the right thing. He would do it badly. He would marry me out of guilt and resent me out of duty, and one day in 15 years our child would walk in on a fight that started about laundry and ended with everything else. I didn't tell him. I said, "I think I want you to leave tonight." He looked relieved. He tried to hide it and he failed. He packed a bag and was gone in under an hour, and I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher until the sun came up. Then I called in sick. Then I called my landlord. Then I called my mother, and I told her my engagement was off, and she said in that voice she uses when she's pretending not to be disappointed, "Well, I always thought he was a little above us, sweetheart." I gave my notice at the hospital the following week. I told them I was moving home to help my mother, which wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth. I sold the things he hadn't taken. I packed 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of books. I bought a one-way Amtrak ticket north because I couldn't afford to fly and because I needed the long, slow time of a train to feel like I was disappearing properly, the way ghosts do. I didn't tell my mother about the baby until I was 4 months along, and there was no hiding it anymore. She cried. Not happy tears. She sat at her kitchen table in the same green cardigan she'd worn for the past decade, and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, what have you done?" That was the worst part of all of it, I think. Not Brennan. Not the betrayal. Not even the long shaking nights when I lay awake convinced I couldn't do this alone. It was the way my mother said, "What have you done?" like I had done something to myself rather than had something done to me. She let me stay. That much I'll give her. She let me have my old room with the daisy wallpaper, and she drove me to the OB appointments 40 minutes away in Burlington because the nearest one closer wasn't taking new patients. And she was there in the delivery room when my daughter came out red-faced and screaming at 4 in the morning on a January day, so cold the windows had ice on the inside of the glass. I named her after my father's mother, who had been the only person in my life who ever looked at me like I was the prize and not the consolation. Her name is Marin. She is 7 now. She has my hair, dark, and stubborn and wavy at the ends, and her father's mouth, the one that pulls down at the corners when she's concentrating, and a laugh that is entirely her own, loud and surprised, like a hiccup that got promoted. The first year nearly broke me. I won't pretend it didn't. I went back to nursing because it was the only thing I knew how to do, but I took a job at a tiny rural clinic that paid less than half what Manhattan had, and I lived with my mother for 2 years because the math didn't work otherwise. She softened, eventually. She'd come to my room at night when the baby was crying, and she couldn't stand the sound of me crying too, and she'd take Marin from me and walk her down the hall, and in the morning we wouldn't talk about it. That was the closest we got. It was something. I bought the farmhouse when Marin was 3. It wasn't much, a sagging 2-bedroom on a half-acre of overgrown pasture with a fence that the deer had laid down years before. The previous owner had let everything go to seed. The roof needed work. The well pump was a wheeze away from quitting. I bought it anyway, with a loan I should not have qualified for and a down payment my mother put up without telling me until the papers were signed. That's where I met him. The second him. I want to be careful about that because I don't want it to sound like a fairy tale, because it wasn't one. His name is Holden. He owns the dairy farm that backs up to my property, and the first time I saw him, he was standing on his side of the dead fence with his arms crossed, watching one of his heifers try to eat my mailbox. He was 41. He had a beard going gray on one side and a daughter from a marriage that had ended badly a long time before, and he wore a Carhartt jacket that had been mended at the elbow with the wrong color thread. "Ma'am," he said when he saw me come out onto the porch with Marin on my hip, "I think this animal believes your mailbox is salad." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in months, and it surprised me so much I almost cried. He helped me chase the heifer back across the property line. He came back the next weekend with a roll of fencing wire and a post hole digger, and he didn't ask permission. He just started working on the section nearest the house. When I came out with a glass of lemonade and tried to thank him, he waved me off and said, "Good fences make good neighbors," and his grandfather had told him so every Sunday for the first 18 years of his life. He took a long time. I want you to understand that because I think it matters. He never asked me out. He never made me feel like I owed him anything for the wire he'd bought with his own money. He'd come over on Saturdays with his daughter, who was a year older than Marin, and the two girls would chase chickens in the yard while he and I sat on the porch and didn't say much of anything at all. He asked me one time about Marin's father. I told him the man wasn't in our lives and never had been, and he nodded once and didn't ask anything else for almost 2 years. We didn't get together until Marin was 5. There was no big moment. He came over one Sunday in October when the leaves were doing that thing they only do here, that hard yellow that almost hurts to look at, and he was helping me put up storm windows. He came down off the ladder and stood next to me on the grass and said, very quietly, "I've been wanting to ask you something for a long time, and I've been afraid to ask it." And I said, "Then ask me." And he said, "Would you mind if I took you to dinner sometime? Just the two of us." I said I wouldn't mind. We got engaged this past June. It's a small ring. He picked it himself, and it's not a diamond. It's a pale green stone, the color of a lake, I've never seen. And when he gave it to me, he said he didn't know if I'd like it because he'd never done this part right the first time. I cried so much Marin came running out of the barn thinking something terrible had happened, and then she saw the ring on my finger and she screamed, the way a 7-year-old screams when she's been told she's going to be a flower girl. And she hugged Holden so hard he had to sit down on the back step to keep from falling over. So that's the life I had built when, 3 weeks ago, I walked into the lobby of a hotel in Boston for my best friend from nursing school's wedding, and I saw him. Brennan. He was standing by the bar with a glass of something brown, and he looked older than I remembered, in the way men look older when their faces start to give back what they've spent. His hair was thinner. He had the small, soft beginning of a stomach that hadn't been there at 32. He was talking to another man, and he hadn't seen me yet, and I had a full 3 seconds to decide what to do before he turned his head. I should tell you that I had not seen this man in 8 years. I had not heard his voice. I had blocked his number the day I moved out, and I had never looked him up. Not once, not even at 3 a.m. with a glass of wine in a weak moment, because I had promised myself that whoever he had become without me was none of my business, and that whoever I became without him was none of his. I want you to know that. I want you to know I had earned my peace. He turned his head. He saw me. He saw me, and his face did this whole little theater in the space of one heartbeat. The shock, then the calculation, then the softening into something I want to call regret. But I'm not sure I have the right to name. He set his glass down. He started across the room. I thought about turning, about pretending I hadn't seen him, about walking back out into the lobby and finding Holden, who was waiting for me in the lounge because he doesn't do well with the cocktail hour part of weddings. I didn't. I stood there. I let him come to me. He said my name like a question. I said, "Hello, Brennan." He asked how I was. I said I was good. He said I looked good. He said thank you. We did this for maybe a minute, this little dance of strangers who had once known each other in the bath, and then he said, "Can I buy you a drink?" And I said, "I'm getting married in the fall." "I don't think that's a good idea." He took it like a slap. I didn't mean it that way. I just couldn't stand the small talk anymore. He looked down at his shoes, which were the same kind of shoes he'd worn when I knew him, the expensive kind that need a polish and never get one, and he said, "I'm happy for you. I really am." Then he looked up and he said, "Can I just ask, the last time I saw you, were you, I always wondered if, never mind. I want to tell you that I lied. I want to tell you that I looked him in the eye and I said, no, there was nothing, you imagined it. Go back to your bar. I want to tell you I protected my daughter from this man who had not earned her. But I have spent 7 years learning how to be honest with myself, and I could not in that moment make myself lie about her. I said, yes." He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. I watched his face go through something I will never forget, and I will not try to describe it because it would not be fair to him, and because there are some kinds of grief that don't belong to me to narrate. He said, "Boy or girl?" I said, "A girl." "She's 7. He said, "What's her name?" I said, "It doesn't matter. She has a father who's going to walk her down the aisle one day, and it isn't you. You walked out of a kitchen 8 years ago, and you didn't come back. And I'm not blaming you for that because I didn't tell you, and that was my doing, and I have lived with that doing every single day since. But she is not your second chance. She is my whole entire life. Do you understand me?" He nodded. He didn't speak. I think he couldn't. He asked me one more thing. He asked if she was happy. I almost cried, but I didn't because I had decided in the time it took to walk across that lobby that I wasn't going to cry in front of him again. Not once, not ever. I said, "She is the happiest child I have ever known. She gets up every morning and she sings to the chickens. She has a stepdad who taught her how to drive a tractor at 6. Her grandmother makes her pancakes with chocolate chips every Saturday. She is loved by a lot of people, Brennan. She has not been missing anything." He said, "Okay." He said it twice, very quietly. Then he said, "I'm glad. I'm really glad." And then he walked back to the bar and he picked up his glass and he didn't look at me again the whole night, even though I caught him almost looking twice during the dinner. I found Holden in the lounge a few minutes later. He took one look at my face and stood up and said, "Are you okay?" I said I was. He said, "Do you want to leave?" I said no, I wanted to stay. I wanted to watch my best friend get married. I wanted to dance with him at the reception. I wanted to eat the bad chicken and drink the good wine and remember that this was my life now. This man with the wrong color elbow patch on his Carhartt who would become, somewhere between the storm windows and the engagement ring, the love of it. He didn't ask what had happened. He doesn't push, and that's part of why I love him. I told him on the drive home, the whole story, every word, and he held my hand on the gear shift, and he didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said, "I'm sorry he hurt you, and I'm grateful he was stupid." We got home a little after midnight. Marin was asleep on the couch with my mother in the chair beside her, knitting something pale yellow for a baby that one of her church friends is having. My mother looked up when we came in and she said, "How was it?" I said it was beautiful. She said, "Did you eat enough?" I said it was beautiful. She said, "Did you eat enough?" I said yes. She kissed my cheek, which she has only started doing in the past 2 years, and she went home. I carried Marin up the stairs. She is too big for me to carry now, really. But she's still small enough that I can do it if I'm careful on the second step where the riser is loose. I laid her down in her bed and I pulled the quilt up to her chin, and she opened her eyes for just a second and said, "Mama, did you have fun?" I said, "Yes, baby, I had fun." She said, "Jess, baby, I had fun." She said, "Did you dance?" I said, "I danced." She smiled with her eyes already closing and she said, "Good," and she was asleep again before I made it to the door. I stood in the hallway for a long time. Holden was downstairs running water for tea, the way he does every night, 2 mugs even though I almost never finish mine. The lamp in our bedroom was on, that soft yellow lamp he bought at a yard sale our second summer together, and the light was coming out under the door and pooling on the floorboards like something warm I could step into. I thought, just for a second, about the woman I had been at 26, standing in a Manhattan kitchen with a sushi container between her and a man who didn't deserve to know. I thought about how scared she was and how alone and how she had no idea that on the other end of all that fear was a daughter, and a fiancé, and a sagging farmhouse with a fence that finally stayed up. I wanted to reach back through 8 years and tell her it would be all right. I wanted to put my hand on her shoulder and say, You are walking out of the worst thing that will ever happen to you, and on the other side of it there is a life so good you will not believe it is yours." But she wouldn't have believed me. I wouldn't have believed me. So I just stood in the hallway and I listened to the kettle whistle downstairs, and I thought, the past doesn't matter anymore. It really doesn't. It made me. And then it let me go, and what I have now is mine. I went down to my fiancé. He had put honey in my tea the way he always does, and he was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me, and the light over the sink was the only light on in the whole house. He looked up when I came in, and he smiled, and I sat down across from him, and I drank my tea. All of it this time. Every last sip. I've thought a lot, in the years since I packed those 2 suitcases and got on that train, about what it really means to be brave. When I was 26, standing in that Chelsea kitchen with a sushi container between me and the man I had loved, I thought bravery was telling the truth out loud. I thought I had failed at it. I thought my silence that night was the worst thing I had ever done, and for a long time I carried the weight of it like a stone in my coat pocket, the kind you forget about until you reach in and feel the cold shape of it again. I don't think that anymore. I think there is a difference between cowardice and clarity, and at the time I couldn't tell them apart. But the years have taught me, telling Brennan that night would have bought him into a life he did not want, and it would have bought my daughter a father who showed up out of obligation, and obligation curdles. I have nursed enough sick children to know what it looks like when a parent stays out of duty. I chose, without knowing I was choosing, to spare Marin that. The cost was that I had to do it alone, and I had to live with the not telling, and there is no version of this story where I get to be both kind to him and kind to her. I picked her. I would pick her again. What I learned is that consequences are not punishments. They are just what comes next. Brennan made his choice in that kitchen, and I made mine, and the river that ran out of those 2 choices is the river I live on now. If I had told him, I would not have a daughter who sings to the chickens. I would not have a fence that stays up. I would not have a man who puts honey in my tea every single night. The life I have was bought with the life I didn't have, and I have stopped grieving the trade. The other thing I learned, and this one took longer, is that you don't earn back your softness by hardening. For a long time I thought the only way to survive what had happened to me was to become a person who could not be hurt that way again, and I built walls inside myself the way you build a stone fence, one cold rock at a time. Holden didn't break those walls. He didn't try. He just sat on the porch with me for 2 years and waited for me to take them down myself, one at a time when I was ready. That patience, that refusal to push was the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me, and I am trying every day to learn how to do it back. If you are in the worst night of your own life right now, I want you to know it is not the end of the story. It is the part where the train pulls out of the station. Get on, take the seat by the window, watch the city disappear behind you. There is a porch somewhere waiting for you, and a person who will sit on it with you, and a child you have not yet met who will need exactly the mother you are about to become.